The autumn rain drummed against the palace windows as Prince Alexander stood in the dusty attic of Rosewood Manor, his grandmother's estate that had been sealed for 20 years. He had come here reluctantly, fulfilling his duty to sort through the belongings before the property was sold. The old Duchess had been a woman of many secrets, and Alexander expected to find nothing more than yellowed photographs and forgotten trinkets. His fingers traced along the edges of antique furniture, each piece covered in white sheets like ghosts from another era. The air smelled of lavender and old wood, bringing back memories of childhood visits when his grandmother would tell him stories of the old kingdom. Those were simpler times before his father's death thrust him into the spotlight of royal duties and political marriages. As he moved deeper into the attic, something caught his eye. Behind an ornate mirror leaning against the wall, there was a small wooden chest he had never seen before. The wood was dark mahogany, polished to a shine despite the years, and secured with a delicate brass lock that had long since tarnished. His heart began to race with curiosity as he carefully lifted the chest and examined it in the dim light filtering through the grimy window. The lock was old but not impossible to open. After searching through his grandmother's belongings, he found a small ring of keys in her jewelry box. The third key fit perfectly, and with a soft click, the chest opened to reveal its contents. Inside, wrapped in silk that had faded from deep blue to a soft gray, lay a leather-bound journal. The leather was worn smooth from years of handling, and the pages were filled with elegant handwriting in faded ink. Alexander's breath caught in his throat as he opened to the first page. At the top, written in careful script, were the words, "The Private Thoughts of Lady Catherine Whitmore, 1998 to 2001. His hands trembled slightly as he realized what he held. Lady Catherine had been his father's first love, the woman who had captured the young prince's heart before duty forced him to marry for political alliance instead of love. The first entry was dated 3 months before his father's engagement to his mother was announced to the world. Alexander's eyes moved across the page, absorbing every word with growing amazement. Catherine wrote about stolen moments in the palace gardens, secret letters passed between them during formal dinners, and the way his father's eyes would find hers across crowded ballrooms. The passion in her words was undeniable, painting a picture of a love so pure and intense that it seemed to leap off the page. As Alexander continued reading, he discovered that their relationship had continued even after his father's engagement. Catherine wrote about clandestine meetings in the old tower of the castle, where they would spend hours talking about their dreams and the life they wished they could have together. She described how his father would bring her wild flowers from the royal gardens and how they would dance to music only they could hear. But it was the entry dated just 2 weeks before his father's wedding that stopped Alexander cold. Catherine wrote about a conversation where his father had begged her to run away with him, to leave everything behind and start a new life somewhere far from the kingdom. She had been tempted, desperately so, but ultimately refused because she knew it would destroy him and everything he had worked for. The next entries revealed the depth of their sacrifice. Catherine wrote about watching the royal wedding on television, tears streaming down her face as she saw the man she loved pledge himself to another. She described the physical pain in her chest, as if her heart was literally breaking. Yet even in her anguish, she wrote about her hope that he would find happiness and that his marriage would bring the kingdom the stability it needed. Alexander found himself completely absorbed in the journal, forgetting about the rain outside and the task at hand. These weren't just the musings of a lovesick young woman. They were the authentic emotions of someone who had loved his father with a depth he had never imagined possible. Every entry revealed new layers to their relationship and painted his father as a man torn between love and duty in a way that made him seem more human than the distant, duty-bound King Alexander remembered. One entry particularly struck him, written during a summer when Catherine had spent several weeks at court as a lady-in-waiting to his mother. She wrote about the cruel irony of serving the woman who had the life she desperately wanted, yet finding herself genuinely caring for his mother's kindness and grace. Catherine struggled with guilt over her continued feelings for his father while witnessing his mother's genuine attempts to make their arranged marriage work. As the afternoon wore on, Alexander found himself crying for the first time since his father's death 3 years earlier. These pages revealed a side of his father he had never known existed, a man capable of deep emotion and passionate love. Growing up, Alexander had seen only the stern king who spoke of duty and responsibility, never the young prince who had once been willing to give up everything for love. The journal entries continued through the years, documenting Catherine's attempts to move on with her life. She wrote about other suitors, travels to distant countries, and her efforts to build a meaningful existence despite the hole in her heart. Yet every few months, she would receive a letter from his father, and her entries would become filled with renewed longing and hope, only to be followed by weeks of despair when reality set in again. Reading about his parents' marriage from Catherine's perspective was particularly painful. She wrote about glimpses she would catch of them at public events, analyzing every gesture and expression for signs of genuine affection between them. Catherine seemed to torture herself by attending these functions, unable to stay away despite knowing how much it hurt her to see them together. Alexander discovered that Catherine had been present at many significant moments of his childhood, though he had no memory of her. She wrote about his christening, his first public appearance, and various royal celebrations where she had watched from a distance as he grew up. Her entries during these times were filled with wonder about what kind of father his father was and whether he ever spoke of their lost love to his son. The emotional weight of these revelations began to overwhelm Alexander. He set the journal aside and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where his grandmother had once taught him about the different flowers. Everything felt different now, colored by this new understanding of his family's history. The perfect royal marriage he had always believed his parents shared was revealed to be built on sacrifice and duty rather than love. As evening approached, Alexander knew he couldn't stop reading now. This journal was changing everything he thought he knew about his father and his family. It was also making him question his own approaching marriage to Princess Isabella, arranged by the council for political reasons, just as his father's had been. The parallels were uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. He picked up the journal again, his hands steadier now, but his heart still racing. There were many more entries to read, and he sensed that the most revealing parts were still to come. Outside, the rain had stopped, but inside the dusty attic, Prince Alexander continued his journey into a past that would forever change his understanding of love, duty, and the true cost of being royal. The candles Alexander had lit to supplement the fading daylight flickered across the journal pages as he continued reading deep into the night. What he discovered next would shake him to his very core and change the trajectory of his entire life. The entries from 1999 revealed that Catherine had not simply pined away in loneliness. She had eventually married Lord Whitmore, a kind and patient man who knew about her past but loved her enough to accept it. Catherine wrote extensively about her guilt over marrying him while still harboring feelings for another, but also about her genuine attempts to build a good life with her husband. Then came the entry that stopped Alexander's world completely. Dated March 15, 2000, Catherine wrote about discovering she was pregnant. But as Alexander read further, the timing became impossible to ignore. She described a final meeting with his father just over 9 months earlier, during a diplomatic gathering where they had found themselves alone in the palace library. The emotion in Catherine's writing was overwhelming as she described their last kiss and the impossible choice that lay before her. Alexander's hands shook as he processed the implications. According to the dates Catherine had carefully recorded, There was a strong possibility that he had a half-sibling somewhere in the world. Catherine wrote about her anguish over whether to tell his father about the pregnancy, ultimately deciding that it would only cause more pain for everyone involved. She chose to let Lord Whitmore believe the child was his, giving the baby a stable family and protecting the royal family from scandal. The entries following the birth painted a picture of Catherine's ongoing struggle with her secret. She wrote about her daughter Elizabeth, describing her bright blue eyes that reminded her painfully of his father, and her quick intelligence that seemed to mirror the royal bloodline. Catherine poured her love into raising Elizabeth while carrying the weight of knowing the child might never know her true heritage. Alexander found himself studying every detail Catherine provided about Elizabeth. She wrote about the girl's love of horses, her fascination with history, and her natural grace that seemed almost royal in its elegance. Most troubling of all, Catherine noted several physical characteristics that unmistakably resembled the royal family, particularly the distinctive cleft in her chin that had marked royal bloodlines for generations. As Elizabeth grew older, Catherine's entries became increasingly conflicted. She wrote about watching her daughter excel at everything she attempted, from academics to athletics, displaying a confidence and natural leadership that seemed to come from noble breeding. The child asked intelligent questions about politics and showed an intuitive understanding of diplomacy that amazed the adults around her. Catherine struggled with whether these traits came from her royal father or were simply coincidental talents. The most heart-wrenching entries dealt with Catherine's occasional encounters with Alexander's father at public events after Elizabeth's birth. She wrote about the agony of watching him from across crowded rooms, wondering if he could see any resemblance to himself in the child she brought to these events. Catherine noted moments when his gaze seemed to linger on Elizabeth with curiosity, but she could never be certain whether he suspected anything or was simply being polite to a young guest. Alexander discovered that Catherine had actually brought Elizabeth to several royal functions over the years, including his own 16th birthday celebration. She described watching nervously as the king spoke briefly with Elizabeth during the receiving line, noting how the young girl seemed completely at ease speaking with royalty. Catherine wrote about the surreal experience of seeing her daughter shake hands with the man who might be her father, both of them completely unaware of their possible connection. The journal entries revealed Catherine's growing concern as Elizabeth began asking questions about her parentage. The girl was intelligent enough to notice that she bore little physical resemblance to Lord Whitmore, and Catherine wrote about the increasingly difficult conversations about family history. Elizabeth had developed an intense interest in the royal family, following their activities in the news and asking probing questions that made Catherine uncomfortable. One particularly painful entry described an incident when Elizabeth was 15. The girl had been studying royal genealogy for a school project and had made observations about certain family traits that hit uncomfortably close to the truth. Catherine wrote about the sleepless nights that followed, wondering if she should reveal everything or continue protecting the secret that had shaped their entire lives. Alexander learned that Catherine had kept detailed records of Elizabeth's achievements and milestones, almost as if she were documenting evidence of royal heritage. The girl had received scholarships to prestigious schools, excelled in languages and diplomacy studies, and showed a natural aptitude for the kinds of skills traditionally taught to royal children. Catherine wrote about the pride and fear she felt watching Elizabeth develop into exactly the kind of young woman who could have been raised in the palace. The entries also revealed Catherine's deteriorating relationship with her husband as the years passed. Lord Whitmore had been patient and understanding, but Catherine's inability to fully commit herself to their marriage had created a distance between them. She wrote about his growing suspicions about Elizabeth's parentage and his gentle attempts to get Catherine to confide in him. The guilt Catherine felt over deceiving such a good man permeated every entry about their marriage. As Alexander read about Catherine's internal struggles, he began to understand the true cost of the choices made by the previous generation. Catherine had sacrificed her own happiness to protect his father's reputation and the stability of the kingdom, but that sacrifice had rippled through multiple lives, affecting her marriage, her relationship with Elizabeth, and potentially depriving his father of knowing his own child. The journal entries from 2001, Catherine's final year of writing, showed her growing desperation to find some resolution to her situation. She wrote about considering telling his father the truth, especially as her marriage to Lord Whitmore became increasingly strained. Catherine described drafting letters that she never sent, letters that would have revealed everything and potentially changed the course of multiple lives. One of the final entries, dated just 3 months before Catherine's death in a car accident, revealed that she had made a decision. She wrote about finally working up the courage to request a private audience with his father, planning to tell him about Elizabeth before it was too late. Catherine had realized that Elizabeth deserved to know the truth about her heritage, and that his father deserved the chance to know his daughter, regardless of the potential consequences. But fate intervened before that meeting could take place. Catherine's final entries spoke of her plans to arrange the meeting through his grandmother, the old Duchess, who had always been sympathetic to her situation. She wrote about gathering photographs and documentation that would prove Elizabeth's parentage, preparing for a conversation that would finally bring the truth into the light. Alexander sat back in his chair as the full weight of the situation hit him. Catherine had died before she could reveal the truth, taking her secret to the grave. Elizabeth, now 24 years old, was living somewhere in the world, possibly his half-sister and potentially in line for the throne, completely unaware of her true identity. His father had died 3 years ago, never knowing he might have had another child. The implications were staggering. If Elizabeth truly was his father's daughter, she would have a legitimate claim to royal succession. More importantly, she was a person who deserved to know the truth about her heritage and her family. Alexander realized he was now the only person alive who possessed this information, and the weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable. As dawn began to break through the attic windows, Alexander closed the journal and tried to process everything he had learned. His entire understanding of his family, his father's character, and his own place in the royal lineage had been fundamentally altered. The perfect royal family image he had grown up believing was revealed to be far more complex and human than he had ever imagined. But perhaps most importantly, he now faced an impossible choice that would determine the rest of his life and potentially the future of the kingdom itself. The weeks following Alexander's discovery of the journal passed in a blur of internal turmoil and careful investigation. He had returned to the palace carrying the weight of Catherine's secret, unable to focus on his royal duties or his approaching marriage to Princess Isabella. Every decision he made now felt monumental. Knowing that somewhere in the world was a young woman who might be his sister and deserved to know the truth about her birthright. Using the palace's extensive resources and the help of his most trusted private secretary, Alexander began a discreet search for Elizabeth Whitmore. What he discovered both amazed and concerned him. Elizabeth had grown into exactly the kind of remarkable young woman Catherine had described in her journal entries. She had graduated summa cum laude from Cambridge with degrees in international relations and history, had worked for several prestigious diplomatic organizations, and currently served as a cultural attaché at the British Embassy in France. More striking than her professional achievements were the photographs Alexander's investigators had obtained. Elizabeth possessed the unmistakable features of the royal bloodline, from the distinctive blue eyes to the aristocratic bearing that seemed to radiate natural authority. Most convincing of all was the cleft in her chin, the same genetic marker that appeared in royal portraits, going back 5 generations. Alexander stared at her photograph for hours, seeing echoes of his father's face and his own features reflected back at him. The investigation revealed that Elizabeth had indeed been raised by Lord Whitmore as his own daughter, though he had died when she was 18, taking any secrets about her parentage with him. Catherine's death in the car accident had left Elizabeth essentially orphaned, though she had managed to build an impressive life for herself through scholarships and her own determination. She lived modestly but with obvious intelligence and grace, exactly as someone with royal blood might if raised outside the palace walls. Alexander discovered that Elizabeth had always harbored questions about her family history. Friends and colleagues described her as someone who seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of protocol and diplomacy that went beyond her formal education. She moved through elite social circles with a confidence that suggested noble breeding, and she had an uncanny ability to navigate complex political situations that impressed even seasoned diplomats. Most intriguingly, Elizabeth had developed what her friends called an obsession with royal history and genealogy. She had written several academic papers on monarchy and constitutional law, and she followed the activities of the royal family with an interest that seemed more personal than professional. Alexander found copies of her scholarly work and was amazed by her insights into royal psychology and the burden of inherited responsibility. As Alexander delved deeper into Elizabeth's life, he faced the mounting pressure of his own royal obligations. The royal council was pushing for his marriage to Princess Isabella to proceed as scheduled, and the international implications of any delay were becoming significant. His engagement had been arranged to strengthen political alliances and trade agreements that would benefit the kingdom, just as his father's marriage had been. The parallels to his father's situation became more painful with each passing day. The weight of his discovery was affecting every aspect of Alexander's life. He found himself unable to sleep, spending hours walking the palace corridors where his father had once walked, wondering if the king had ever suspected he might have another child. Alexander studied portraits of his father with new eyes, looking for signs of the passionate young man Catherine had described in her journal, trying to reconcile that image with the stern monarch he remembered. His relationship with his mother had also become complicated. Queen Margaret had always been kind and dutiful, but Alexander now understood that she had lived her entire marriage knowing her husband's heart belonged to another woman. He watched her with new compassion, recognizing the strength it must have taken to build a loving family despite the circumstances of their union. Yet he also realized that revealing Elizabeth's existence would potentially devastate his mother and call into question the legitimacy of their entire family line. The decision of what to do with Catherine's journal and the knowledge it contained consumed Alexander's every waking moment. Legal experts he consulted confidentially confirmed that if Elizabeth could prove her royal parentage, she would indeed have a legitimate claim to succession. As his father's firstborn child, she could theoretically challenge Alexander's right to the throne, though the complexity of proving paternity after so many years would make such a claim difficult to pursue. More importantly to Alexander was the moral dimension of the situation. Elizabeth deserved to know the truth about her heritage, regardless of the political implications. She had grown up believing herself to be the daughter of a kind but ordinary nobleman, never knowing she might be connected to the royal family she studied so intensively. The knowledge of her true parentage could help her understand herself in ways she had never been able to before. After weeks of agonizing deliberation, Alexander made his decision. He would approach Elizabeth directly, sharing Catherine's journal and allowing her to decide how she wanted to proceed with the information. It was a choice that could potentially cost him his throne and certainly would change his life forever, but it was the only option that honored both Catherine's memory and Elizabeth's right to know the truth. Alexander arranged to travel to Paris under the pretense of diplomatic business, carrying Catherine's journal in a secure briefcase. He had researched Elizabeth's schedule and knew she would be attending a cultural reception at the British Embassy, an event where he could encounter her naturally without arousing suspicion. The irony of meeting his potential sister at a diplomatic function, much like the events where their father had once encountered Catherine, was not lost on him. The night of the reception, Alexander stood in the elegant ballroom of the British Embassy, searching the crowd for the young woman whose photograph he had studied so intensively. When he finally spotted Elizabeth across the room, the resemblance to their father was so striking that Alexander had to steady himself against a nearby pillar. She moved through the crowd with natural grace, engaging in conversations that seemed to energize rather than drain her, displaying the kind of social skills that were typically bred into royalty from birth. Their introduction was arranged through the ambassador, who was thrilled to present the young cultural attaché to the visiting prince. When Elizabeth curtsied and looked up into Alexander's eyes, he saw instant recognition there, not of him, specifically, but of some deeper connection she couldn't quite place. Her smile was warm but puzzled, as if she were trying to solve a mystery she didn't even know existed. As they spoke throughout the evening, Alexander was amazed by Elizabeth's intelligence and natural diplomacy. She discussed international affairs with the kind of insight that usually came from years of palace briefings, and she had an intuitive understanding of royal protocol that impressed even Alexander's experienced security detail. Most remarkably, she seemed completely comfortable in his presence, displaying none of the nervousness or awe that usually characterized people's first encounters with royalty. During a quiet moment in the embassy gardens, Alexander finally found the courage to begin the conversation that would change both their lives. He started carefully, asking Elizabeth about her family history and her interest in royal genealogy. Her responses revealed the depth of her questions about her own identity and her lifelong fascination with understanding bloodlines and inheritance. When Alexander finally revealed that he had discovered Catherine Whitmore's journal and the secrets it contained, Elizabeth's reaction was everything he had hoped for and feared. She listened with growing amazement as he described the love affair between Catherine and his father, the impossible choices they had made, and the possibility that she might be his half-sister and heir to the throne. Elizabeth's response was measured and thoughtful, displaying the kind of emotional intelligence that suggested royal breeding. She asked careful questions about the evidence and the implications, showing more concern for the truth than for the potential benefits to her own life. When Alexander offered to show her Catherine's journal, she accepted with the gravity the moment deserved, understanding that she was about to learn something that would change everything she thought she knew about herself. As they sat together in the embassy garden, reading Catherine's words by moonlight, Alexander watched Elizabeth's face transform with recognition and wonder. She traced her fingers over her mother's handwriting, tears streaming down her cheeks as she finally understood the love story that had shaped her entire existence. The truth Catherine had died trying to reveal was finally coming to light, brought into the open by the very son she had protected through her sacrifice. The consequences of this revelation would ripple through the royal family, the government, and potentially the entire kingdom. Elizabeth would have to decide whether to pursue her claim to the throne or remain in the life she had built for herself. Alexander would have to face the royal council and his mother with news that could destabilize everything they had worked to preserve. Both of them would have to navigate a future where duty and love, heritage and choice would create challenges neither had ever imagined possible. But in that moment, sitting in the quiet garden with Catherine's journal between them, Alexander and Elizabeth were simply two people who had finally found the family they never knew they had lost. The journal that had remained hidden for so many years had finally surfaced at exactly the right moment, bringing truth and connection where there had been only secrets and separation. Catherine's love story had found its conclusion at last, not in the reunion she had dreamed of, but in the meeting of the children whose lives had been shaped by her sacrifice and her unwavering devotion to the truth.